아이고, 잘 잡혔습니다. 제가 안 잡혔으면 진짜 100명 이상은 내가 죽였을 것입니다.
The nation of Korea is no stranger to evil. The period under the Japanese rule, from 1910 to 1945, the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, a domestic uprising of citizens against the government. Today's story seems to be a knock-on effect from those horrible events which created a man of pure evil that shook all of South Korea. G'day there everyone, welcome to Bedtime Crime, a channel related to serial killers, murder stories, and much more. So, please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and let's get into today's story. Before the 80s, Korea was a very poor country. The poverty rate was very high, however the rich still existed. There was a clear distinction between the poor and the rich, and there still is today. Yoo Young-Chul, on the 18th of April 1970, was born into poverty. His family life was unstable. Both his father and his brother died of epilepsy, and he wasn't close to his mother. Like most people, Yoo would envy the rich. But unlike most people, Yoo's hatred for the rich would intensify as the years went on. Though being a man who had a lot of hate, he considered himself to be a deeply religious man. However, his faith in religion would turn into him believing that he was doing God's work. On the evening of September 24th, 2003, a 72-year-old professor and his wife, who was 67, were sitting at home in a quiet but expensive neighborhood of Sinsadong, Seoul. Sinsadong is well known to be an area of many wealthy citizens. My guess is that you would walk around these neighborhoods and peek into the houses. He would grow angrier seeing what life he wasn't able to live. And on that very night in September, he would decide to release that anger. Yoo broke into the elderly couple's house and bludgeoned the couple with a makeshift hammer. The hammer was customized, with the head being a sledgehammer and the handle being a regular size hammer, making each blow very lethal. The fact that he made the hammer himself could indicate that his intentions were very clear from the beginning. After the murder was carried out, Yoo tried to make it look like a robbery murder. However, Yoo didn't take anything from the home. He did, however, try to erase as much evidence linking him to the murder as possible. Murders weren't uncommon during this time in Seoul, so at this point, this murder wasn't seen as anything too different. On October the 9th, 2003, in the neighborhood of Gugidong in Seoul, lived a successful, hardworking, and humble businessman. However, that evening, the man of the house was not home. Who was home was the 58-year-old wife, the man's 82-year-old mother, and his 35-year-old son. Yoo that night made his way into the house, beating the mother in the bathroom, the wife in the kitchen, and then walking upstairs to confront the son at the top and beat him to death. The scene was described by the police as beyond horrific. The wife was unrecognizable after she was murdered. The citizens of Seoul were aware of the two murders. However, no link was made to the public at this point. On October the 16th, 2003, in Samsung-dong, Seoul, Yoo broke into a house where a 70-year-old male and his 69-year-old wife lived. The wife was dragged into her bedroom and beaten. She was later found by her son. Though Yoo attempted to clean up what evidence he could, investigators were able to find footprints that matched in the Gugidong and the Samsung-dong murders. The wounds left on the victims also seemed to be very similar. The media were putting dots together, claiming it to be a possible serial killer. However, the police at this time did their best to cover up as much information as possible. The last thing they wanted was the public to think that there was a serial killer on the loose. However, they only had to wait a little over a month before they had to go back on their words. On November 18th, 2003, Yoo entered a house in Haehwadong around 2:30 p.m. Living there was the owner, an 87-year-old male, and a 53-year-old female housekeeper. At the time, a 1-year-old boy, presumably the house owner's grandson, was also staying with him. Yoo killed both the house owner and the housekeeper in the bedroom, and soon after the house was set on fire in an effort to destroy evidence. Luckily, neighbors were able to get to the scene and the 1-year-old boy survived the murders and fire. At this point, the police had only the shoe print and the victim's wounds to go by. Though they found the make of the shoe, it wasn't enough to even narrow the suspects down. Remember, though Seoul is a relatively small city in regards to physical size, it had a population of 9 million in 2003. It wasn't easy for police to track down suspects. However, the fourth murder in Haehwadong produced CCTV footage nearby the crime scene. The CCTV footage showed a man walking away from the camera, wearing dark clothes. It was found that the person in the CCTV footage was wearing the victim's jacket. This was the first visual evidence of Yoo. The footage and what little evidence was now released to the public, and this sent the city of Seoul into panic. At first, police were worried that if they released the footage, that the killer would change his methods, and they were right to think this way. Though Seoul was in a panic of finding who this serial killer was, murders of the same nature would suddenly stop. On April the 13th, 2004, Yoo was watching a vendor selling Viagra and adult videos outside a local market in Chungju, Seoul. He thought it was a good opportunity to extort money from the vendor, while at the same time impersonating a police officer. Impersonating an officer was something that Yoo has been reported to do many times. This was a way for Yoo to make money. However, this time was different. Yoo handcuffed the vendor and put him in the back of a van. Though Yoo presented a fake police ID, the vendor still didn't believe him. Yoo took the man to Wolmido in Incheon. In fear that the vendor would reveal his ID, Yoo brutally murdered the vendor, this time using a knife. Again, trying to remove as much evidence as possible, Yoo removed the handcuffs and noticed that there were marks left behind. So Yoo cut off the victim's hands and threw them into the sea. He then set fire to the van. Since this was not like the previous murders that Yoo had committed, the police did not link the murders together. From March to July 2004, Yoo moved on to victims to who the public cared less about at the time. These kinds of people were sex workers. Sort of like the case of Samuel Little, when a sex worker goes missing, there wasn't as much investigation into the crime. However, the culture is very different in America than in Korea. In America, illegal prostitution is usually committed on a corner, on a street, in some private locations. For Korea, they have massage parlors, karaoke rooms, and public red light districts. Prostitution is highly illegal, but owners of said organizations are known to pay off police, and police would then turn a blind eye. Though the situation is better these days, it's still a well-known culture. So when a worker goes missing, no one would go looking, or if someone knew, they dare not to alert authorities, due to the police who were actually doing their jobs correctly would report the business. Yoo killed the wealthy out of rage and jealousy, but now he moved his frustration and anger towards women. Some reports claim that Yoo's hatred for women stems back from when his ex-girlfriend, who was a masseuse, broke up with him. Some reports say that he had a hatred towards his own wife, which he wanted to kill. Reports of 11 women were murdered by Yoo. Even today, reports on the female victims are quite vague. However, between the months of March 2004 and July 2004, Yoo went on a violent killing spree. Most of the female victims were between the ages of 20 to 39. Some of the female victims were lured into Yu's house after it was agreed to pay for sex. Some of the female victims were called to Yu's house from illegal brothels. Yu's style of killing grew more grotesque as well. He would still beat women, but was also reported to strangle. The murders he would commit in his house were in his bathroom. This would make the cleaning process easier for Yu. Before, Yu would kill people in their own houses and then make a run for it. But now, Yu had bodies to dispose of. So, Yu would cut the body into pieces, decapitate the head, and let the blood drain. He then would try and disguise the smell by putting the body parts in with kimchi, and then dispose most of his victims near Bongwon Temple, not too far behind the famous Yonsei University. Yu would often call the same massage parlors to request girls. The owner of one of those massage parlors was starting to grow suspicious. Some of their workers would go missing, which raised even more suspicion. One night, Yu called the massage parlor, but this time Yu called from the phone of one of the missing workers from that parlor. Yu organized a meetup with a worker at a small park in Hongik University. Unbeknownst to Yu, an officer and the massage parlor owner were watching from a distance. The worker meets Yu, but in a strange twist of events, Yu asks her to leave, saying she was too tall for his liking. Most people would think this is normal. People have preferences, and this girl wasn't his. But the main reason why he didn't like tall girls was they were harder to dispose. However, he wasn't finished that night. It seemed that he was eager to kill. He calls the business again and asks to meet another worker in an alleyway. The worker, the owner, and the detective, and now a team leader of the police agency, go to the agreed upon location. This time the detectives make their move and they grab Yu. A struggle breaks out, but they finally have Yu in cuffs. At this point, Yu wasn't even connected to the killings of the wealthy. He was only thought to be connected to the sex workers going missing. However, after a heated interrogation, where police would play a game of reverse psychology and some light physical tactics, Yu angrily confessed to the 4 murders in Haewa-dong, Shinsa-dong, Samsung-dong, and Gugi-dong. This confession caught the police off guard. For proof that he had killed, Yu led the police to many of the sites where the murders occurred, including the burial sites. Though at first, some of Yu's confessions seemed to be a little bit off or didn't match up to what actually happened, it was finally concluded by detectives that he was in fact the killer. After all this, why was he called the Raincoat Killer? Yu was nicknamed the Raincoat Killer only because after he was captured, and the media found out, he had to wear a raincoat to help conceal his identity. It is very common for offenders in Korea to cover up their face. Some reports say he could have killed more people. He said himself that he has killed more. However, nothing has been proved to date. Prosecutors requested the death penalty for Yu, to which Yu thanked them for requesting it. However, the last person to die of the death penalty in South Korea was in 1997. Yu was charged on the 13th of December 2004 for 20 counts of murder. He still resides in Seoul prison. My thoughts on this case? Well, I currently reside in South Korea, and this story rings through the ears of many other Koreans. I can only imagine what many people were thinking during that time, especially women who were just walking home. Korea is quite a safe place, but it does have its creeps from time to time. Korea has a very good record with tracking down killers, but let's hope this killer doesn't inspire anyone else. Thank you for listening to today's story, and if you want to support the channel, remember to like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next story.